Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, we're going to be looking at how to sew a patch pocket, the kind of pocket that you would apply to a shirt. We'll be going over a few different techniques that you can use to ensure that you have professional looking pockets on your garments in the future.
So here is my paper pocket pattern, and I've gone ahead and cut one of these out for this example. Now the pocket pattern is simply based around a square or a rectangle that you like the size of. For this example, I have a square that is 14 centimeters, about 5.5 inches in width and height. I've then added a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to the side and the bottom edge. The top edge needs to have enough fabric for a facing to finish the top edge of the pocket, and mine is 2 centimeters 3/4 of an inch. It will fold to the wrong side like so. And then I have another 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that will fold underneath to finish this top edge. The grain line of this pattern piece is generally aligned to the center front of the garment. Now the first thing that I would like you to do is to finish the edges of your pocket, and I'm going to do this with an overlocker or serger. If you don't have an overlocker or serger, you really don't need to worry here, because once we've sewn the pocket in place, the likelihood of these edges fraying is very slim. Simply sew down the lengthwise edges as well as the bottom edge of the pocket on the overlocker. You don't need to do anything fancy with the corners here. I would sew one section, stop, cut my thread, sew the next section, stop, cut my thread, and continue. The two tips that I have is that one, you want to ensure that you're not cutting any of the material off. You should be running this right up against the blade of the overlocker or serger, or you can remove the blade if you want to. The second tip that I have is to make sure that you don't pull or distort your work. When you get to the end of the seam, simply run off the fabric a little bit and then trim your threads. After overlocking, I would give this a nice flat press, and you can simply trim away the threads. We don't need to secure them because they're going to be secured when we sew the pocket in place. The next step is to finish the top edge of this pocket. Grab your iron. You're going to want to press under the 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch seam allowance along the top edge towards the wrong side of the pocket. Then you're going to want to work to press under the facing amount of the pocket. In my example, it's 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to press this to the wrong side first. And then I'm going to take my work and I'm going to fold the facing over so that the right sides are together. I'm not going to unfold the top seam allowance edge that I've also pressed in position. Place a pin on both sides and you're going to be sewing this from the top folded edge down at the seam allowance. Mine is 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter. Backstitch at the start and at the end to secure this. Once sewn, you can fold the seam allowance and turn your work around. Use a point turner if you need to poke out the corner. Do this on both sides and then give your work a nice press. Now we're going to want to correct the shape of the rest of the pocket. You're going to want to press under the edges on both the sides and the bottom by the seam allowance that you're working with. Mine was 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Now the tricky thing that you might have with pockets is you may have more than one on a garment and you need to ensure that they look symmetrical. So what I often do is have a pocket pattern template. This is made out of card and it's the same size as my pocket pattern piece, but it does not have any seam allowances on it. I use this to place up into the pocket, right up into the facing, and then press my seam allowances in position around it. If you find that your seam allowances are a little bit smaller than you imagined, you don't need to really worry, because as long as your pockets are all symmetrical, little things like that won't matter. Once you're happy that you have your pocket pressed in position, you're then going to want to finish that top edge of your facing. Usually, I use my edge stitching foot to do this at the sewing machine, and I will sew this with the wrong side of my pocket facing up to ensure that I'm catching the facing edge. However, I usually make sure that I'm using the top edge of the pocket as my marker when I'm sewing, rather than the distance from my edge stitching foot. This is because I want to ensure that the stitching line is straight and perfect on the right side of the garment. Complete a small back stitch at the start and end of the seam. And here is the sewn facing from the right side of the fabric and from the wrong side of the fabric. Now we can position our pocket onto our garment. You would usually have the pocket placement marked on your garment fabric. You can do this by using carbon paper and a tracing wheel, chalk or a removable pen, or thread tracing and tailor's tacks. It really depends on the material that you're working with. You want to ensure that the markings are clearly visible and that they don't damage your material. Check that your pocket is positioned in the correct place and aligns with the markings. Use a ruler as well if you need to ensure that the pocket measures the correct distance from the seams or from a placket. If you have a garment with two symmetrical pockets, you want to ensure that both of the pockets are in exactly the same position on both sides. Often I will fold my garment in half to double check things like this. Once you're happy with the pocket position, you can use pins to position it in place. If you're working with a tricky fabric or perhaps you're pattern matching, I would recommend that you tack or baste your pocket in position prior to going to the sewing machine. This just ensures that nothing moves while you're sewing. Otherwise, you're welcome to use pins like I'm doing here. We're going to be sewing the pocket on, starting at the right-hand top edge, moving our way around the bottom of the pocket and back up to the left-hand top edge. At the top corners, we need to add a few more stitches to give a little bit more durability to the pocket. This is my preferred method for a standard shirt pocket. Although I usually sew this at the machine, if you are new to sewing, it can be a good idea to draw it on with chalk or a removable pen. Measure in along the top edge 1/4 inch, approximately 6 millimeters. Then draw on an angle from this drawn measurement down to where the facing stitching is. Draw the same shape on both sides to ensure that you have a symmetrical pocket. And then we can head to the sewing machine. I'm starting on the top right-hand side of my pocket. Although I'm using an edge stitching foot, the needle is currently in the center of the foot. Position the needle in where the drawn line meets the stitching across the facing edge of the pocket. Complete 1 or 2 back stitches. Sew along the drawn line on an angle to the top pocket edge. Position the needle into the fabric, raise the presser foot, and turn your work. If a single stitch will be too short or too long, you can use the hand wheel on the side of the sewing machine to position the needle in exactly where you need it. Sew across the top of the pocket. With an edge stitching foot, you are welcome to move the needle if you want to make the sewing around the pocket easier. Usually I move mine 1 or 2 places towards the pocket. If you don't like the idea of having to move the needle from the center to the side, you're welcome to start sewing with the needle in the right place. As long as you've marked your stitching lines for that top edge of the pocket, you should be able to follow them. Alternatively, use a foot that works for your sewing machine and move your needle as you need to. For a shirt, you will generally want to be stitching about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, 2 to 3 millimeters. Continue sewing down the one side of the pocket. When you get to the bottom corner, you will position the needle in, raise the presser foot, and turn your work. Continue working around the rest of the pocket until you get back up to the top edge. Here, just like with the first side, you will start by positioning in the needle, raising the presser foot, and sewing across the top of the pocket. I usually sew for about 3 to 4 stitches. Then you will position your needle down into the material, raise the presser foot, and turn your work again. If you have drawn on your stitching line, you can leave the needle where it is and just ensure that your needle is going in on the stitching line. Alternatively, with an edge stitching foot, you may wish to center your needle again. Do this with the needle raised and ensure that when you position your needle back into the fabric, that there isn't a jump in your stitching. I usually position my needle back into the fabric by turning the hand wheel on the sewing machine and placing it by eye to ensure that it aligns with the previous stitch. Sew until you meet the stitching of the facing. Backstitch 1 to 2 stitches to secure, and that would finish the sewing of the pocket. If you are a little bit concerned about sewing the 2 top corners of the pocket, you're welcome to actually sew around the pocket first. Start sewing on the right-hand top edge, complete a single backstitch to secure, and then sew all the way around the pocket. When you get around to the top edge on the second side of the pocket, you can choose to complete the finishing technique to secure that top edge in place. Usually, I sew this by eye and I do not draw it on. I will sew 3 to 4 stitches across the top and then sew on an angle towards the corner of the facing. Once I've completed this side of the pocket, I would then position my needle back in on the first top side. I would sew 1 stitch forwards and backwards to secure it here. Sew the same number of stitches across the top edge, position my needle in, turn my work, and then sew on an angle towards that corner where the stitching of the facing meets the edge stitching of the pocket. Backstitch 1 or 2 stitches to secure. And here we have your finished sewn pocket. This is my sample, and here are some examples of what it looks like on an actual garment. I would finish this with a nice press, and then you're ready to continue with your garment construction.
Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next one.